Hi, grade 12s, it's your teacher. So, what we're going to do is today we're going to actually physically start with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We will start to explain the background behind it. The last time I saw you, I gave you the glossary and the important terms that you need to know. So, yeah, let's just jump into it. Oh, let me just Right, so some important figures that you will have to be aware of and know for this unit. The first is President John F. Kennedy. He was the President of the United States of America at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You will also remember him from the Civil Rights Movement. Right, so the next one is Nikita Khrushchev. He was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He took over from Stalin. And then let's go to Cuba. The important figures from Cuba that you need to know is Fulgencio Batista. If you're having trouble remembering the name, some of you will be aware of the wrestler, Batista. He also stars in Guardians of the Galaxy. The wrestler, not Fulgencio. He isn't really that important, but you'll see he'll get mentioned in the beginning of the background. So he was basically the president of Cuba until 1959, after which he was ousted and Fidel Castro took over. So Fidel Castro actually only died in 2016, and he was the prime minister of Cuba, took over after Batista was ousted. And I think he later became the president of Cuba. So before I go any further, let's have some fun with flags. So just give me a moment. Okay, so this is just for your own enrichment purposes, and sometimes also in the sources they will make reference to these things. The flag you see in front of you here is the flag of Cuba. So you'll notice that it looks quite similar to the American flag. Obviously the colors are inverted and you only have the one little star and this little triangle here. And then next we have the Soviet Union flag. Now what is incredibly important is that you understand this little symbol. It's going to appear a lot. So the hammer and the sickle especially. I think the star stands for Communist China, the hammer stands for industrial workers, and the sickle stands for agricultural workers. So you're going to see this a lot in the background, and it's going to be in images, and they're going to ask you to identify what does the symbol stand for, or why is the symbol there, and then you will know if you see it, it means that the USSR was involved, Soviet Union. Next we've got the flag of the United States of America. We are all familiar with this one. Alright, so now let's get back to our PowerPoint. Give me a moment. Okay, so this is actually from a different PowerPoint than the one that I established myself, but the problem is the PowerPoint that I made, I lost the original file, so I only basically have the PowerPoint slideshow and I can't update it with new things and new facts. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to refer back to this PowerPoint in terms of images and things like that. So one of the first headings that you'll get is why was Cuba important. So I just want you to have a look where the United States is, Mexico, and you'll notice that Cuba is incredibly close to where the United States is. It's like literally just off the coast of Florida. And that is important because the United States was a capitalist country. So you'll remember when I was describing the Cold War in the previous video, I told you that there was this whole big fight between the capitalist USA and the communist USSR. And in 1959, Cuba actually becomes communist. And this completely freaks out America because they can't have a communist country that is so very, very close to their borders. they are worried, as I said before, about the Red Scare, the spread of communism. They don't want communism to spread into the United States of America. So the minute they hear that Cuba has become communist, they start panicking. They start thinking, what can they do to get rid of this communist Cuba? So let's go back to the previous slideshow. So why was Cuba important? From the onset of the Cold War up until the late 1950s, the USA focused its attention on Europe and Asia. So they were in places like Italy, they were in places like Turkey. They were trying to stop communism in Europe. They didn't really bother with what was happening in Southern America and South America. So in 1959, the USA extended its influence to Central America. So we're talking about places like Mexico. And at the center of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Caribbean island of Cuba, which was located about 150 kilometers south of mainland USA. So you can observe here, that is Cuba, our little bugger here that becomes communist and freaks everyone out. Here is America. Also in the map, oh, oopsie, let me go back. You can see that if a missile is launched from Cuba, they can basically wipe out this little area here. Remember, this is normal missiles, not nuclear missiles at this stage. If they launch an even bigger missile from Cuba, it can destroy up to that amount of places in the United States of America. So you can see Salt Lake City, Denver, Kansas, Chicago, New York, Washington, New Orleans, and Phoenix would be completely wiped out. So let's go to the Cuba in 1959. So before 1959, the USA and Cuba had a very good relationship. They were the best of friends. And the reason for that is that the leader at the time, our man Fulgencio Batista, he was very pro-American. He allowed Americans to use Cuba as a kind of holiday resort. There were lots of American businesses there. A lot of the crops were actually sold to America. Cubans traded with America, and there were several American military bases in Cuba. Many American citizens also used Cuba as a sort of a holiday destination. And one of the problems that was created by this very, very good relationship between America and Cuba is that ordinary Cubans and poor Cubans were taken advantage of. And it led to a wide gap between rich and poor Cubans, as is usually the case with capitalism. And these poor Cubans and ordinary Cubans were very resentful of the fact that America basically had a do what you want card in their country. And a lot of them actually wanted America out. So after 1959, there is a revolution where these poor Cubans and ordinary Cubans basically organize a rebel force and push Fulgencio Batista out of power. He then takes power again undemocratically, and therefore more people start joining in on the revolution. When I say he, I mean Batista. He comes back and he tries to take the power back, and he manages to succeed, but he does it in a way that is very unfair. He holds unfair elections, and as a result 90% of the Cubans end up joining the revolutionary force. I am exaggerating, by the way. I don't know if 90% is the actual number of Cubans, but just know that most Cubans were completely against Batista, against the way that he was running the country, and against the way that he came into power. So Fidel Castro basically leads the revolutionary force against Batista, and he is very anti-American. Just a fun fact, America tried to kill him several times over the amount of years that he was in power, and it even got so ridiculous to the extent that America even poisoned his cigars, because they know that he is well known for his Cuban cigars and smoking his cigars. And America was really not fond of Fidel Castro. So Fidel Castro adopts many anti-American ideas and implements them. So for some, just to give you a bit of background as to the kind of things that he did. he started to nationalize many of the Cuban business. So remember I told you previously that there were a lot of American businesses in Cuba? What he did was that he took over those businesses and he said these are now government businesses. And obviously that would make the Americans very upset because it's their business that has now been stolen. Um, so many Americans end up leaving Cuba, because of the fact that their businesses were nationalized and their industries were nationalized. You can already start to see the beginnings of a communist country in Cuba because America doesn't believe in nationalism, which basically means that government owns or government takes over a industry or business. So you can already see that start of that anti-American ideas. Many Americans are no longer allowed to come to Cuba on holiday and things like that. So, as a kind of retaliatory response to this, America refuses to buy Cuban sugar, um, which is absolutely devastating to the Cuban economy because they make their money by selling sugar and by selling cigars. And now one of the biggest countries in the world is not buying from them anymore, which means they're losing a lot of money. So they've got all these industries and they've got all this sugar and they've got all these cigars and things and they cannot sell them. So what would you do if you were in Fidel Castro's shoes? You can see that one of the biggest countries in the world is no longer cooperating with you, doesn't want to help you anymore. Remember, this is within the framework of the Cold War. What are you going to do? Who are you going to go to if America is not going to help you? If you guess the USSR, you guess right. So you will remember that the Soviet Union is like the bitter enemy of America during the Cold War. And so Castro turns to the Soviet Union for help. I'm sure you guys have heard of the phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the USSR agrees to assist Cuba. Initially, they just agreed to buy their sugar, but eventually it also elevates to the extent where Castro allows the USSR to establish and set up nuclear missile bases in Cuba. So it says, Soviet Union, you are helping me out, I'll help you out, you can put a missile base in Cuba. It's fine. I agree with this. And the USA basically fails in its attempt to invade Cuba and assassinate Castro. So I'm going to stop the lesson here, and tomorrow I will speak about the beginning of the crisis, just because I think this is a very good spot to stop. So I'll see you next time, grade 12s. Hope this was informative. If you have any questions, you can leave them down in the comment section below. And basically just make sure that you have these notes. If you have the resource pack that I gave you, all of these notes are in the resource pack as well. So thanks and goodbye.